Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Little Nemo, the Dream Master, a third-person platforming title developed and published by Capcom and released for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1990. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into Little Nemo, the Dream Master, I thought it'd be a good idea to talk to you about why I chose this game for this particular episode. And actually, I didn't choose it. This one was chosen by Super Smash Burger, who sponsored this particular episode. Unfortunately, Super Smash Burger did not have an opportunity to record a sponsor message for this podcast, but regardless, thank you for your sponsorship and your support. And we do have a couple of listener comments, which we'll be including in just a little bit. Now, I felt like I should also relay a little bit of a personal anecdote experience, whatever you want to call it, about Little Nemo, the Dream Master, because for whatever reason, this is a game that I had always heard about. I always knew about its existence. I've seen it on store shelves, and I've always wondered what the heck this game actually was. And I've got to admit something that is just a little bit embarrassing. For some reason, and I have no idea why this is, when I thought about Little Nemo, the Dream Master, I always thought, and this is something I thought from a very young age, I always thought that this was like some sort of Michael Jackson oriented game. I looking back at it now and thinking about it now, because while I've known about the game, I have not thought about Little Nemo in years. And I have no idea why my younger self thought, oh, that must be a game associated with Michael Jackson in some way. It is a very weird association. I have no idea why that association exists for me. I mean, I know about the real Michael Jackson game, Moonwalker. I know about that for the Sega Genesis, but I don't know. Why did I associate Little Nemo, the Dream Master, with Michael Jackson? I don't know that we'll ever figure out the answer to that question. I know that it's weird, but that is what was always in my head. And for whatever reason, I always thought to myself, I guess that's cool, but I don't know that I really need to play this. So this is one of those games that has always sat on the shelf. I've always been curious about it because, well, at the time, I was always curious about why Michael Jackson would be in a game about dreams. But I guess the answer to that question is he is not. And I can confirm he is not, because I did in fact play Little Nemo for this episode, and it is not a Michael Jackson game. It's actually a very different kind of game. So I have no idea why, and I honestly was kind of conflicted about even mentioning this during the episode, because it really paints me in a not great light. It's like, what are you thinking, Tony? Like, what are you thinking? How could you have possibly? I don't know. I don't know why I have that association, but I do. Regardless, after learning more about the real Little Nemo and not the thing that was somehow created in my head, and learning that it was widely considered to be a very difficult game and potentially not as good as other Capcom 8-bit platformers, regardless of the non-Michael Jackson association, I was curious. What is Little Nemo really like? And because Capcom is one of the better developers for licensed titles, or at least was in the 80s, I was incredibly curious whether Little Nemo could maintain Capcom's overall level of quality for licensed titles, or if, as many people have suggested, it might fall a little bit flat. Maybe it would tarnish a little bit of Capcom's 8-bit quality legacy. I don't know. We'll have to find out, and to do that, we will have to listen in as we start talking about Little Nemo. Our first stop in our deep dive into Little Nemo the Dream Master starts with all of you, as you did send in several comments for today's episode. Film Kid writes, I am very glad to see an episode on Little Nemo the Dream Master. This game is, for me, the embodiment of the saying, people will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. I barely remember any details about this game other than you play as a boy named Nemo and you go off to Dreamland. Oh, and you give animals candy? That can't be vet approved. Anyway, what I 100% do remember is pure happiness playing my NES with the Little Nemo Dream Master cart inside. Couldn't tell you if the game holds up today or even if I actually finished it back then. All I know is as soon as I saw this title as an upcoming episode, I had the biggest smile. Looking forward to Tony's thoughts, and thank you Super Smash Burger for sponsoring this one. Hopefully you had many joyous memories of the game. Thank you Film Kid for your comment. Little Nemo is definitely one of those games that a lot of people hold in very high esteem. It'll be interesting to see how it holds up today. We also got a couple of notes from Grayor, who wrote, that game is absolutely hard as hell, but I love the vibes. Epic soundtrack, too. And then we had a note from the Bay, who says, I was technically, I feel potentially a little too old for Little Nemo, but I loved it. I couldn't agree more. It was so amazing. Great story, great gameplay, some difficulty, but very approachable. I think my cousins owned it. Such a great game. I can hear the jingle at the beginning of a level right now. Or the animals sleeping. Thank you, the Bay, for your comment. Grayer, thank you for your comment as well. Once again, this is a game that a ton of people hold in high regard. We're going to have to see how that actually holds up today, and to start, we're going to begin by discussing its history. Little Nemo the Dream Master is a third-person platforming title developed and published by Capcom and released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1990. Before we can talk about Little Nemo the Dream Master, we need to dive back into history to discuss Nemo's origins, which surprisingly were first created all the way back in the early 1900s. But before we even get to that, we've got to talk a little bit about the early years of animation. Animation in film and media is something that is fairly prevalent today. You have studios that have become incredible juggernauts of animation and high-quality feature films, cartoons on television, and television series. You have studios like Disney, Don Bluth of Dragon's Lair fame and other films and video games that he created throughout his career. Studio Ghibli, DreamWorks Animation, so many different studios exist today that were able to take animation and create an entire film industry around it. But as is often the case, animation didn't simply spring into existence and become pervasive across the entire Hollywood and film industry and television industry. No, as with most things, animation got its start in much humbler times. The concept of animating for the purposes of projecting moving images to an audience began to get some traction in the mid to late 1800s. Yes, I said 1800s, as the precursors to cinema projectors like the kinetoscope and vitascope began to be demonstrated at various museums and fairs around the world. These early projection systems were designed for individual users, but would over time expand to be able to display moving images to an audience of onlookers. The main focus of the time, though, as you might expect, was recording real people and playing back pre-recorded imagery to these audiences, effectively as silent films, because the concept of the talkie and the technology that would enable that type of recording was still decades away. So at this point in history, when we're talking about animation, we haven't even gotten to animation yet. So what we're really talking about is the act of filming individuals, filming actors, and playing those filmed sequences back to someone, whether that was an individual or an audience. Some individuals, though, would begin to experiment with the concept of creating hand-drawn animated imagery to be stitched together into primitive cartoons. Now, these earliest efforts were very, very simple. Think about things like a static background with a superimposed, almost stop-frame animated overlay of simplistic characters performing some action, like walking or hiding behind a bush. They're similar in concept to old-time picture flip books, where as you flip from page to page, an animation plays out. And you could literally, and I remember this from when I was younger, I would get these flip books, and they were just a novelty, really. It wasn't like, certainly when I was younger, there was real animation, real films, and things like that. But you would get these flip books, and you would just kind of flip through the pages, and you would see each of the different quote-unquote frames, which was really a different page in the book. You would see an animation play out, and when I was younger, I thought that was the coolest thing. Well, back in the 1800s, that wasn't just the coolest thing, that was the thing. And as people started to convert those more primitive physical kinds of objects into something you could actually watch on a projected screen, you started to get the very first animations that were available that literally did play without somebody having to interact with them. It would play as almost like a movie. That being said, these were not truly film, because the concept of film wouldn't happen until a little bit later. But you could certainly say that these were the earliest animations that were prevalent in a film-like medium. Anyway, a lot of these early efforts were simple, but still impactful, as not only was the eventual concept of cinema being explored, but so too was the concept of creating animated features that could stand side by side with real recorded content as an alternative approach to storytelling. At least eventually. While the concept of telling a story via animated film wasn't quite a thing yet in the late 1800s, that didn't mean talented artists couldn't tell visual and compelling narratives with other forms of media. In fact, one of the more popular forms of entertainment around this time was the venerable comic strip, a form of art that persists to this very day and can still be found in both print and online newspapers. There were a number of artists and illustrators that have worked on comic strips over the years, though for the purposes of our discussion today, we're going to focus on one of the more influential and innovative comic strip authors of the time, a man named Winsor McCay. Winsor McCay was born around 1866, and from his earliest age, McCay was interested in creating art and drawing pictures, similar in many ways to other artistic individuals that we've spoken about on other episodes of the podcast, like fellow comic strip creator Steve Purcell of Sam and Max fame. Even before McCay could hold a pencil, though, he demonstrated a penchant for art, a talent that was first on display while witnessing a fire in his town when he was incredibly young. As he watched the harrowing scene, McCay picked up a nail, and in the frost-covered window through which he was observing the fire, he etched a detailed drawing of the imagery, with much more skill than you would expect from someone who likely couldn't form complete sentences just yet, but was apparently able to actually create artwork with a nail on a frosted window. As you might expect, it turns out that McCay was a natural, and as he grew older, he learned that he could recreate vivid and lifelike scenes from memory without needing any sort of visual aid to assist in his work. While his father wasn't too keen on McCay pursuing art as a career because he assumed art really wasn't going to pay for much of anything, he would actually force McCay to attend business school, but as is often the case, you can't stifle someone's true passion. McCay would enroll in business school based on his father's wishes, but would almost never attend any classes. Instead, he would go off to various locations with a lot of foot traffic, set up an easel, and then offer to create portraits for people for 25 cents a piece. Definitely not the same thing as going to business school, but certainly a form of business education itself, as McKay began making some money through the use of his artistic talents. Being an artist offering portraits to people passing by on the street wasn't necessarily a rarity, especially in the late 1800s, but here McKay did have an ace up his sleeve. He wasn't just an artist on the street trying to make some money. He was a really good artist on the street trying to make some money, and oftentimes would have a crowd of onlookers watching him create his portraits, all of them transfixed by the quality of his artwork. This would garner the attention of not just interested onlookers, but also academic instructors, some of whom were so impressed that they offered to teach McKay privately, hoping to hone his natural talent into something even greater. McKay leapt at this opportunity, and for the next several years, he would learn the mechanics and science behind the creation of art, and in the process, would become even more skilled. As McKay's skill grew, he would become more and more popular wherever he went, as crowds continued to be impressed by the speed with which he could churn out paintings, drawings, and various other artwork, all of which were highly detailed and expertly designed. McKay was effectively living his best life. He had a talent he enjoyed using, he garnered a ton of attention anytime he picked up a pencil or a paintbrush, and he believed that his future was going to be as bright as it could possibly be. Around this time, he decided to begin working for various newspaper and magazine publications, freelancing as he learned how to create comic strips, a process that came nearly as naturally as every other artistic facet of McKay's life up to this point. Eventually, his skill would lead him to become a full-fledged comic strip creator and artist, and as the early 1900s rolled around, McKay would begin creating a number of different comic strips that would begin resonating with individuals around the world. These comic strips would often be simple in concept, but deeper in meaning, and would, like his other art, be highly detailed, which, coupled with the speed with which he could create art, allowed McKay to create a ridiculous amount of work in a very short period of time. Some of his early comic strips, like Little Sammy Sneeze, which told the story of a boy whose sneeze would slowly build across a given comic strip's panels and would eventually release, causing some sort of mayhem, would be relatively short-lived, with a publication run of just 1.5 years. Other ideas, however, would have much stronger staying power, such as the comic strip that would ultimately prove to be McKay's masterpiece, and a harbinger of things to come: Little Nemo in Slumberland. The concept behind Little Nemo was, like Little Sammy Sneeze, pretty simple in nature. It was originally created to inspire something in children. A lot of McKay's earlier comic strips, while they were comic-oriented, they were really focused for adults. They were really tried to be an adult-oriented comic strip. Little Nemo was designed from the very beginning to be something for younger individuals. His son, Robert, was actually used as the inspiration behind Nemo's design. And the whole strip, and most of the comic strips for Little Nemo in general, followed a very similar structure. They would usually start with Nemo falling asleep. And as soon as he would fall asleep, he would begin to explore Slumberland, this magical world where dreams would happen and nightmares would need to be thwarted. After Nemo completed whatever adventure was in store for him for that week's comic strip, he would oftentimes at the end of that strip wake up, most of the time being awoken by his mother and telling him, "What are you doing sleeping all the time? Nemo, it's time to get up." So this was a very simple concept. But the execution of that concept was unlike most other comic strips of the time. The art style that McKay utilized was highly detailed, and if you ever take a look at some of Winsor McKay's artwork, you will see a level of detail that, quite frankly, is well beyond what you would expect from a comic strip. The comic panels that were used within that comic strip also had some innovation built into them. Comic strips around this time in history were oftentimes very straightforward and very consistent from panel to panel. If you were looking at a comic strip with, say, 5 panels, every single panel would be the same exact size, the same exact shape, and they would progress usually from left to right. McKay didn't do that. He experimented with comic panels that were not the same size, not the same orientation, very similar to what you would see in comic books that would eventually become prevalent throughout the majority of the 1900s into certainly today, where you have companies like Marvel and DC Comics and other companies that have made comic books into a true art form. Winsor McCay, back in the early 1900s, was experimenting with comic panels that were not simply straightforward boxes. Just as an example, if one of his stories called for a forest to begin growing, the comic panels containing that forest would grow on the page. This style of comic design was not prevalent around this time in history. And one of the other things that McCay had always prided himself on was the fact that the stories he would come up with would tap into natural human emotion and experience. In the case of Little Nemo and Slumberland, McCay figured, well, almost everyone dreams. And because the majority of Little Nemo's adventures were based on dreams, and those dreams were based on fairly typical dreams that people might have, this meant that every story in a Little Nemo comic would, in a way, be recognizable to many of the comic strip's readers. It created an association that was automatically familiar with anybody who might read the comic strip. McCay hadn't realized it yet, but he had already struck gold with Little Nemo and Slumberland. His work would lead to a ridiculous amount of attention across the art world, as numerous people reached out to McCay to begin giving demonstrations of his art style and technique. And as McCay continued to create his newly popular Little Nemo comic strip, he would also go on tour with a theater troupe, whereby he would be paid $500 a week to draw 25 different sketches in 15 minutes for a live audience. For anyone who may be wondering, that amounts to a salary of over $17,000 in today's money, each and every week. That is a ridiculous sum of money and a true demonstration of just how talented and revered McCay was. As McCay made money touring, he would also continue to focus on various Little Nemo projects, including the creation of a stage show with a $100,000 budget in 1907 dollars, which amounts to $3.4 million today, as well as one of the earliest forms of animated film, so to speak, an area of innovation that McCay himself had a particular interest in. Recall our discussion on the early days of animation from a couple minutes ago, where simple drawings might be overlaid over pre-existing backgrounds to create a sort of animated motion, with characters performing jerky movements on a projected screen. Well, McCay had seen an early demonstration of this style of animation back in the late 1800s, and while he didn't know it at the time, eventually he would think to himself, I can do better. That concept is what would drive him to begin exploring film animation in 1911, which is when he decided to bring the characters from his Little Nemo comic strip to the bigger, but still not quite big, screen. McCay was inspired to create something the world had never seen before, and set out to create a hybrid live-action animated film, whereby pre-recorded acted sequences would be spliced with hand-drawn animation to demonstrate a style of moving picture that the public had no idea was even possible. This first film, which was simply called Little Nemo, would feature 4,000 hand-drawn frames of animation, which McCay created over a period of just 1 month, which is an absolutely insane level of output for a single artist. And if anyone is curious, I highly encourage you to try to watch this 1911 film, as the level of animation and the quality of the artwork was light years beyond anything that had come before it, and in fact would almost look rotoscoped in some ways, a style of animation that wouldn't even be invented until 1915. We've talked a lot about rotoscoping in prior episodes of the podcast, but just to provide a little bit of a refresher, the concept of rotoscoping was a way for early animation to look much more lifelike, and the way it would work is individuals would film someone, an actor, portraying something or acting out a scene, or potentially dancing in a ballroom. And then those frames of pre-recorded scenes or pre-recorded photography would then be painted over or drawn over to create an animated look to that original motion. So rather than having animators have to figure out how to create lifelike animations just based on their own knowledge, they could effectively trace these pre-recorded images and create animation from them. That was the first way that rotoscoping would be used for animation. Rotoscoping would be used in later efforts as well, most prominently in several Disney films from the 1950s, as well as for Star Wars. The lightsaber effect was actually rotoscoped to create that effect from a more practical perspective in film. So, the concept of rotoscoping wouldn't be invented until 1915, and if you watch the 1911 film Little Nemo that McKay had created, you would swear that there was some rotoscoped animation there because it is so smooth and detailed that you could only question how an individual could create this, especially around this time in history, without some sort of extra help. It turns out McKay did not have extra help, he was simply that talented. After McKay's first film in 1911, he would go on to make a number of other films over the course of the next decade, with 10 total films created by 1920. And in later years, McKay would actually claim that he was most proud of his accomplishments in this early era of animation, which once again predates the majority of true film-based animation that would become prevalent throughout the 1900s. And lest anyone think McKay's boasts were simply bravado, even future animators and cartoonists, like Walt Disney, would recognize McKay's greatness. Disney himself would host an episode of his Disneyland television show, focusing on the story of animated drawing. And during that episode, he would discuss the history of animation with a reference to McKay himself. While McKay had unfortunately passed away by this point, his son Robert was in attendance for the recording of that show, and Disney himself pulled Robert aside, pointed to his own Disney empire, and said, "Bob, all this should be your father's," effectively declaring that McKay, while not quite as well remembered as other artists and creators, was as important to the genesis of animation and film as anyone else in history. Anyway, putting aside McKay's work on animated films, his most influential and popular creation was by far Little Nemo. And over the years, that comic strip would be adapted into stage plays, movies, operas, songs, and, perhaps most pertinent to our discussion today, video games. So, at this point in our discussion, we're going to fast forward to the 1980s, where, surprisingly, work was underway on the creation of a full-length animated film based on, you may have guessed it, Little Nemo. That film was called Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, and over the course of the 80s would be shopped around to a number of different Hollywood studios and directors, including such luminaries as George Lucas, who ultimately turned down an offer to work on the film. The movie would eventually see the light of day in 1989, at least in Japan, with the United States release following in 1992. Though, interestingly, it was the original Japanese release of the film that would end up spawning our game of the day, as movie and television licensed property stalwarts Capcom would get the opportunity to make yet another licensed title, the 1990 NES game that would eventually come to be known as Little Nemo: The Dream Master. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, licensed titles. They get a bad rap, to say it the least. To put it mildly, licensed titles in video games are oftentimes not looked at fondly. And if we take a look at some of our prior episodes of the podcast, we will see examples of licensed titles that may not have been quite as good as what you might have hoped. Think about a game like E.T. for the Atari 2600, which is effectively the poster boy for a poor quality licensed title. I gave you all my opinion on E.T., which isn't necessarily the same as everyone else's back, I guess at this point. I don't remember what episode it was, but it was a while ago at this point. So take a look in the archives if you're curious about E.T. But the simple fact is that when different intellectual property began to be licensed for video games, a lot of times those licensed properties were looked at as cash grabs. From a film production studio perspective, it really didn't take much to give a certain intellectual property or character or world to a video game developer and say, hey, go off and create a game. Because at that point, the owner of that intellectual property is making money regardless of if the game performs well or not. The video game developers and publishers had to give those individuals, the film production studios or whomever, some amount of money to license their creations. It's then on the part of the video game team to be able to actually create something that's worthwhile. But at that point, the film production studio, they've made their money. They were paid for the license. So if the video game didn't perform well, no big deal. From a film perspective or from a film studio perspective, they still made their money. Because of that, film studios were very happy to license their characters and creations to video game developers. And video game developers were hopeful that regardless of what kind of game they would put out, they'd make some money, because if you had a popular film or television property, you could almost be sure that fans of that property would flock to the video games that were made with those characters and inside those worlds. The thing is, though, that wouldn't always happen. And even though the majority of licensed games, especially in the 80s, were kind of shovelware kinds of experiences, that didn't mean that all licensed properties were devoid of value. And in fact, there were some companies that took great pride in any time they would create a video game, whether that was based on original intellectual property or a licensed kind of situation. And one of the companies that really did focus on delivering high-quality video game entertainment, regardless of what they worked on, was Capcom. Capcom worked on a number of licensed games over the course of the 80s and beyond. And generally speaking, and granted, you can't make this blanket statement just totally without context, but for the most part, Capcom's work on licensed titles were highly respected and revered across the video game and computer game landscape. One of the most prominent licensed titles, and one we actually have another episode about back in our archives, is DuckTales, where Capcom took that Disney license and created a game that resonated with so many players that it would be remade in later years and still maintains a permanent spot in the hearts of many gamers who had played it. That is a prime example of a licensed title that did the license justice. And Capcom in general always wanted to focus on creating high-quality video games and entertainment. So, when Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, the film, came out, and Capcom was given the opportunity to create a video game about that film, they knew that they were the right company for the job. Now, in Japan, because of the timing, it was obvious that Little Nemo the Dream Master, which was the NES game or Famicom game that Capcom created in Japan, it was obvious that that title was intended to be a licensed tie-in to the movie Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, because the movie would come out in 1989 and then the game would follow shortly thereafter. But here in the United States, there was no movie to tie that game into, because the game came out on the NES in 1990, but the movie wouldn't release in the United States until 1992. Maybe that's why I always assumed Little Nemo was a standalone game based on something else. And I know I mentioned Michael Jackson, but I still don't have any idea why that was. But maybe that's why I never knew. And I honestly didn't even know up until I started researching this topic for the podcast. I didn't realize that Little Nemo the Dream Master was in fact a licensed title. I assumed it was just a standalone effort by Capcom. Maybe something just that Capcom came up with themselves. But no, it was in fact licensed, and it was in fact based on that film, Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland. That wouldn't come out until 1992 in the United States, and it must have completely passed me by because I had no recollection of that film at all, and certainly never tied it into the NES game that would come out, Little Nemo the Dream Master. Regardless, the fact is that Little Nemo would release in 1990 on the NES, and despite the fact that many individuals in the United States did not realize this was a licensed game, and certainly didn't realize this was a licensed game with almost 100 years worth of history behind it, the game would garner a fair amount of attention amongst gamers, with many declaring the game to be a solid platforming title, and some even suggesting that it was one of the better NES games ever released. Critics of the time shared similar sentiments, with many praising the game's graphics, music, gameplay, and difficulty, though modern analysis has cast a bit of a different light on the game, with more modern reviewers claiming the game doesn't hold up as well as other classic NES platformers, with some suggesting that the music is bland and that the gameplay is just too difficult even when compared to other Nintendo hard titles. I will relay my own opinion on the game in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, retrospective reviews are a bit more mixed than the praise Little Nemo received when it originally released 35 years ago. Little Nemo as a property continues to remain in the public spotlight though, with the most recent Nemo-related experience being Netflix's 2022 film Slumberland, a movie that I have not personally watched, but had previously heard about, and admittedly, had no clue that it was based on Little Nemo at all. It turns out that Little Nemo, despite having been birthed in the early 1900s, still remains culturally significant and impactful, even today. Yet another demonstration of Winsor McCay's genius and influence. He may not be as well known as the Walt Disneys of the world, but his accomplishments and the continued significance of his work speak for itself. Turning our attention back to the game, the main question on my mind is, does Little Nemo the Dream Master still hold up today, 35 years after it originally graced our collective television sets? Or is it one of those titles that is simply a licensed game that should not be remembered? We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Little Nemo today versus when it was released over 30 years ago. Little Nemo the Dream Master is in many ways a fairly traditional 8-bit platforming title. You have to move through a variety of levels by going up, down, left, right, and all around fairly expansive stages to traverse various obstacles, jumping from platform to platform, avoiding or attacking enemies depending on the situation, swimming through various waterways, and ultimately making your way to the end of each stage to do it all over again for the next level. In many ways, the core mechanics here are very similar to other Capcom platforming titles like the Disney-licensed DuckTales or Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. If you've ever played any Capcom-licensed title before, you're going to know what you're effectively getting with Little Nemo the Dream Master, at least from an overall structural and control perspective. But the fact is that Little Nemo the Dream Master is very much its own platforming experience, and it has a ton of little touches and unique design mechanics that make it stand apart from other Capcom platform titles of the 8-bit era, as well as just platforming titles in general. So let's talk about what makes Little Nemo the Dream Master Little Nemo. The game is split up into 7 main platforming stages, and then also includes a final 8th stage, which is actually structured a little bit differently than all of the other stages in the game, with 3 mini-stages itself, each of which has a boss to defeat at the end of those mini-stages. We're going to talk about both sets of stages separately, because they each feature slightly different gameplay, so we're going to start by talking about the 7 main stages in the game. Your goal in each of these stages is to get from the start of the level to the end of the level, which sounds pretty straightforward. But when you get to the end of the level, you're going to encounter a locked door with multiple locks that need to be, well, they need to be unlocked. So the question is, how do you do that? Well, the answer to that question is by finding keys that are scattered about each level. Now let's talk about the general structure of each of these levels. You have, within each level in Little Nemo the Dream Master, a fairly expansive world to explore. This would never be considered an open world game, so to speak. It is not open world, but within each of these platforming levels, you have a fairly expansive stage to explore. And the fact is, you're going to have to explore each of those levels in order to conquer them, because hidden throughout every single level is a bunch of keys. And the number of keys could range anywhere from around 5-ish up to I think 7, somewhere around there. It's usually around 6-ish keys each level that you have to find before you can open the door at the end of the level. Those keys can be hidden anywhere within a given stage. They might be high up above where you currently are in the treetops, or they might be under the water in a hidden cavern, or they might be in an area where you just simply don't even see or can't get to as your default Nemo character. They're hidden all over the place, and this actually encourages exploration. And for what it's worth, and we'll talk more about the exploration aspect of the game in a little bit, exploring Little Nemo the Dream Master is actually delightful. I loved exploring each of these stages looking for the different keys that might be hidden there. And you have to do that. You absolutely have to find the keys in order to unlock the door at the end of the level. Otherwise, you're not going to progress through the game. So the keys are a core mechanic, and having to traverse and explore each individual level is effectively the main gameplay loop for the game. But as you're going through each of these levels too, not only are there keys hidden all around, but there's also a bunch of different secret areas and just secret locations that I was legitimately surprised even existed. There were some spots where you would go into a stage and you might see a little bit of water and you think, okay, well, maybe I'll swim in that water. You go, you swim in it, and you think to yourself, what happens if I swim down? Now, in many games, you swim down and that would spell the end of your life. But in Little Nemo the Dream Master, more times than not, you swim down and there's something under the water. There might be additional underwater areas. There might be a cavern that you fall into after you drop down from that waterway. And sometimes those caverns are required, meaning they might have a key that you need to progress, but a lot of times they're not. They might just have an extra life, or they might have a power-up of some sort, or a special animal companion that you can use. We'll talk more about animals in a little bit. But it might just be something off the beaten path that has something cool to find, or something that might be beneficial as far as extra lives or that kind of stuff is concerned. There's a lot of these little secrets hidden throughout the game. You could look in a given level and you might find an area and think to yourself, that looks a little strange. You walk into it and suddenly you're whisked away to another secret area. The number of secrets in the game is not huge. Like, it's not a gigantic number of secrets in each of the stages, but there is enough. There's just enough that as you're exploring, it feels like there is a lot more depth to the game than just the core gameplay and platforming sections that you might see at face value. It adds a lot of value to the game just to be able to explore around and find these secret areas randomly, because there's just a ton of them. There's a bunch. Like I said, there's not like a ridiculous number, but there is a bunch of stuff to discover here. And even beyond that, each of the levels in the game, and we're going to talk about each of the levels in a fair amount of detail, but each of the levels are very distinct from each other. There's a pretty good variety of levels across the game. A lot of times you'll just be able to go around and explore, but you might be exploring in a forest, you might be exploring in a house, you might be exploring in a train or on a train. There's a ton of different areas to explore, and each of the levels are very visually and mechanically distinct. The mechanics, it's really more about the animal companions that you'll be able to befriend, but the overall gameplay and the overall diversity of the levels really does enhance the overall feeling of playing the game. Now, if all you had to do was find keys while controlling the titular boy, Nemo, that'd make for a fairly traditional, albeit still expansive, platforming experience. But what makes Little Nemo unique is that in this game, you don't just control a single character. Instead, you're able to take control of any number of animals and use their skills to reach various areas of levels that are otherwise inaccessible, or they allow you to defeat enemies that are otherwise impervious to Nemo's attacks. The thing is that Nemo by default has a very limited moveset. You can jump in the air, and you can throw some candy around, which against enemies can act as a sort of stun, but you can't really defeat enemies with your candy, and you can't really defeat them by jumping on top of them because that makes you take damage. You can also walk around levels pretty darn slowly as you explore the environment, but that's pretty much everything you can do with Nemo as a default character. So you might realize that if all you could do was control Nemo, the game would actually be a somewhat mediocre experience, because controlling Nemo, well, fine, I guess, isn't really all that interesting. But it turns out that by finding certain animals that are scattered across each level, you can feed them some of your candy, 3 pieces of the candy to be exact, after which they fall asleep, and then you can use them to continue progressing through a given level. Animal companions open up the gameplay of Little Nemo dramatically, and each animal companion has a specific skill set that you'll need to use to make your way through each level to find each key you need to unlock the door at the end of a given level. Let's go through all of the animals that I found in the game. It's entirely possible there are more, because like I said, there are some secret areas, and I don't know that I found every single one of them, but I did find a bunch of animals as I played the game. So let's talk through some of their special abilities and how they enhance the overall feeling of playing the game. The first animal you'll likely encounter is a frog. The frog moves very slowly, but can jump high and far, as you would expect from a frog. This makes traversing levels and jumping from platform to platform fairly easy. but also can make some tricky jumps, like needing to limit your jump height to avoid spikes above you, a little bit more difficult than if you were using a different animal or simply controlling Nemo himself. Still, the frog is a very useful animal companion. And even beyond the level traversal features of the frog mechanic, you can also jump on top of a bunch of enemies to defeat them, which is something that Nemo can't do in his base form, and some of the other animals can't even do that in their forms. But a frog, you can jump on top of their heads, similar to any other number of platforming titles, and defeat those enemies. The frog is a way to get over Nemo's relatively limited skill set, because Nemo effectively has no way of dispatching enemies at all. So the frog, even though it's one of the earliest animals that you might find, is a major improvement overall to you playing the game. You might also find a mole in certain levels, and moles can dig in dirt, and that's pretty much it. This is a very situationally useful animal, and only appears in a couple sections of the game, because sometimes you do have to dig under the dirt to find either keys or to find a secret area. Still, it is cool when you learn that you can dig underground and potentially find new secret areas. This is just another aspect of the game where you're playing it, you find this new animal, you feed it some candy, you control it, and then you realize, oh, wait a second, I can keep digging down and there's actually something under there? That's a pretty cool moment of discovery within an 8-bit platforming title, and as anybody who has played many 8-bit platforming titles knows, they're not always all that filled with a bunch of different secrets. Certainly the great ones are, but the majority are not. This one does have a fair number of secrets, and it's cool to be able to find those as you play the game. Going back to our animals, one of the other animals you might find is an ape. Now, apes are very strong. They can punch enemies and climb walls and trees. But as far as jumping ability, it's fairly limited. And you cannot jump on enemies to defeat them in ape form. You have to punch them if you're trying to defeat them. You might think that climbing walls and trees would be a huge benefit and would offset some of the limited jumping ability. Only here, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag, because climbing in this game, and there are a few different areas where you can climb as different animals, but climbing in this game takes a little bit of getting used to. There were plenty of times where I would be climbing up a tree or a wall, and I would get near the top, and I would get kind of stuck on the level geometry, and I would have to jump and move around and try to get off of that wall to get back onto solid ground. That doesn't sound like it would be a big deal, but there are some areas where there are enemies that are trying to attack you, and sometimes you can get caught on these walls as you're trying to climb them and get attacked by enemies and lose some hit points, and that doesn't feel all that great. I think there was a way, probably, to improve the climbing mechanics here beyond what's in the actual game. It's not a huge deal at the end of the day, and it's something you can get used to. But when you first start climbing in different stages and you start climbing trees or walls or whatever you're trying to climb, you will probably notice that the climbing mechanics here are not quite as smooth as what you would hope. Like I said, not a big deal, but is something that warrants mentioning. Anyway, moving on, we also have a lizard in the game. Now, lizards can also climb walls, and they can jump around way more effectively than an ape can. There's nothing really super special about lizards, other than the fact that they move pretty darn fast, which can be useful in various levels where you have to avoid certain obstacles. Moving faster might be better. You also have a hornet, which is by far one of my favorite animal companions in the game. Hornets can fly for a limited period of time, which makes traversing levels and getting to out-of-reach places really easy. This is one of the main areas, by the way, that you're going to be able to explore. One of the main animals that you'll use to explore different levels. The hornet can fly almost anywhere, which is legitimately awesome as you're trying to explore the game. You do eventually need to land to recover your stamina a little bit, because as you fly around, you're going to deplete that stamina. There's not like a stamina meter in the game. It's probably around, 10-ish or so flaps of your wings before you have to get down and get some stamina back. The good news is that most of the levels that have hornets in them have plenty of places to rest, so it's really not much of an issue at the end of the day. But it is something that you have to take into account, because if you're flying around and you run out of stamina and then you start plummeting to the ground, that's not a great feeling. As a hornet, you can also fire stingers at enemies while you fly, which makes this the only animal companion with a ranged attack, which, as you might imagine, can be really useful. As you explore the game, you might also encounter a hermit crab. Now, they can jump around and dig in sand, and can also use its claws to attack enemies. Basically, the hermit crab is a better, more capable version of a mole. But other than that, it's okay. I guess. It's once again fairly situationally useful. It's not my favorite animal by far, but it's definitely more useful than the mole, which literally can only dig in the ground. You can also find a fish, which, let me tell you, they swim fast, but that's pretty much it. It's about as situationally useful as a mole, but not much more than that. And then finally, you can find a mouse. Mice can climb walls fairly slowly, but also carry a sledgehammer that you can use to break certain walls open. The mouse is required in certain levels where you might find a certain wall that you need to break down with that sledgehammer. But otherwise, the mouse isn't really my favorite companion. It just moves a little bit too slowly. The sledgehammer attack is just a little bit harder to judge timing with as far as trying to attack enemies. The mouse, like I said, is required in some locations, but otherwise, I would never seek out the mouse as my preferred animal companion. So as you can see, each animal is pretty darn unique, and all of them have varying amounts of hit points, with the base amount being 3, just like Nemo, but some of them have 4 or 5 hit points themselves, making them way more tanky than Nemo and other animal companions. That life bar, by the way, is shared across Nemo and his animal friends, though the maximum hit points for an animal or Nemo himself can never increase over the maximum for that animal. Meaning, let's say you're an ape and you have a full hit point bar of 5 hit points, and then you revert back to Nemo. Well, you'll still have full life, but now you'll only have 3 hit points. So it's not like changing into an animal and then changing back to Nemo will automatically augment Nemo's life bar. It's literally the maximum per form, so to speak, as you play the game. And speaking of hit points, every single enemy in the game will do damage to you, and it does behoove you to maximize your hit points whenever possible, because there will be sections of the game that seem designed simply to hurt you. We're going to talk more about the game's difficulty in a little bit, but for now, just recognize that you will almost certainly take some damage as you play the game. Now luckily, you can replenish your hit points by finding various restorative items as you play the game. There are potions, there are medkits. Those are kinds of items that you can pick up that restore some of your hit points. And the game is fairly, I'd say they do a pretty good job of providing enough hit point restoration items to make it so that you're never really struggling as you play the game. Beyond the hit points, though, you also have 3 lives available, if you lose all your hit points, because if you don't, then you're fine. But when you do, you will lose a life. And similar to potions and medkits, you can find extra lives hidden in various levels throughout the game. If you do end up losing all of your lives, though, it's game over. Though, in one of the more user-friendly 8-bit platforming experiences that I've personally experienced, you do have unlimited continues available, with the only punishment being that you have to restart whatever level you might have died in, which is legitimately not that much of a punishment at all, so I appreciated the fact that Capcom didn't make this game ridiculously difficult from a having to restart from the beginning perspective. What this means is that anyone can beat Little Nemo if you spend enough time playing it and learning the game's levels, enemies, and mechanics. Actually gaining that proficiency, though, that can take a little bit of time. Which means we should probably talk about the game's difficulty a bit more before we move on. So, I do have to mention, and this is something that I was a little bit surprised about, and as I started to play the game, I started to wonder if I was experiencing something just a little bit differently than what most people have talked about. I have heard, by looking at various forums or watching videos or just kind of looking at some of the history behind Little Nemo, I've heard many people claim that Little Nemo is one of the more difficult NES platforming titles available. Some people have labeled it Nintendo Hard, which usually is reserved for games like Battletoads and Ninja Gaiden, the games that you always think about when you think about difficult games. Little Nemo, I had never thought about as a difficult game. I mean, the fact is I hadn't really thought about it all that much over the years, but this game doesn't really come up in the standard kind of lists of very difficult NES games. Yet when I started looking more into this title specifically, there were tons of people that were complaining about the difficulty in the game. I don't really see it, to be honest with you. It's just, as I played the game, I was expecting something super difficult because of some of the feedback that I had heard and some of the different forum posts that I had seen. But the fact is, I don't see it. It's really not all that difficult. The difficulty in this game is a mix of platforming and puzzling. Now you might be wondering, puzzling? Like puzzling in a platforming game? And I say, yes, because each level requires exploration, and oftentimes that exploration requires figuring out which animals to use when in each of the levels to both get past obstacles and enemies, as well as to find the various keys scattered throughout each level. We went through all of the animals that you can find in the game. The fact is, the animals are not just window dressing. They are a core mechanic to how you play the game, and many of the levels are designed such that you have to use certain animals to get through certain sections of the game. That seems like it might be a fairly straightforward kind of thing, but in reality, it creates a more puzzle-centric kind of experience. It's not a deep puzzle experience, mind you, but it is something where you've got to figure out the right way to proceed forward and the right path forward and how to use the mechanics that are available to you, which animals and how to get through different areas of the level, where you need to explore with different animals to find keys. It's all about figuring that out. It does take a little bit of time to figure that out, but honestly, that's where a lot of the challenge in the game is simply trying to figure out the quote-unquote puzzle of each level that will enable you to find the right keys that are hidden throughout the level to be able to unlock the door at the end of each level. Like I mentioned before, most of the levels here have 6 or more keys to find, and they can be hidden in any number of places, which means, and that's why, you need to use your animals to progress. And I will admit that sometimes it's not really obvious what you need to do. Now, occasionally you may find an NPC at the start of a level that gives you a clue about which animals you need to use to help you get through a given stage. But for the most part, you're going to need to experiment just a little bit to figure out how to find the keys and beat each level, which may lead to some situations where death is the only option. So I guess it's sort of difficult, but also not really, because you have unlimited continues available. And I have long said that a game can be ultra difficult, like the platforming, the action, the overall experience of playing the game. Make it as difficult as you want. But if you give me unlimited continues, I cannot rank the game as one of the most quote-unquote difficult games of all time, because you have your progress effectively saved. I am a firm believer that difficulty is totally fine. Challenge is totally fine, as long as tedium is removed. And a lot of times, the games that were released around this era, their difficulty was semi-artificial because they combined challenging mechanics, which those I am fine with either limited or no continues, which honestly I am not fine with, because having to play the same exact game over and over and over again, getting proficient enough to beat the entire game, when in reality what ultimately ends up happening is, because you can only get to a certain point of progress before you see something new and you've got to learn that new level or whatever you might be playing, you will eventually get to the point where the first 6, 7, 8 levels of a game are so easy for you that it is simply tedious to get through those 8 levels to get to the part that is currently challenging you. That is artificial difficulty to me, or I guess I should call it artificial gameplay time, or it's artificial. It makes games artificially long, and I don't really like that mechanic. I know a ton of games from the past have used that mechanic, and some of them are true classics. But at the end of the day, I still don't like it. I do not like limited or no continues in games. I love to be challenged, but I don't like to have to go through the same exact thing over and over and over again, especially after certain sections of the game have become so simple that I can basically walk through them in my sleep. That's where the tedium sets in, and that's where certain games prevent you from really experiencing and enjoying all that it has to offer. Just because a game might be able to be beaten in, say, 4 hours with unlimited continues versus 12 hours with no continues, that doesn't make it a better game. Actually, it's a better game if it's a little bit more streamlined, at least from my perspective. So anyway, bottom line about Little Nemo, I didn't expect Little Nemo to be quite as, I'm not going to call it easy, because it's not easy, but I didn't expect it to be as little challenge as what it was, because everything I read about it beforehand suggested it was pretty darn difficult. It does have a mix of platforming and puzzle solving here, which I did not expect, but honestly, I thought it was insanely well balanced. For 7 levels in the game, Even the dreaded train level, that is one of the levels in the game. The train level many people have compared the train level to the turbo tunnel from Battletoads, that ultra difficult level 3 stage that oftentimes for many spelled the end of many Battletoads playthroughs. The fact is, that's not a valid comparison at all. The train level here is not nearly as challenging as the turbo tunnel from Battletoads, and certainly not as challenging as some of the later levels from Battletoad. But regardless, put that aside. For 7 levels, Little Nemo is legitimately perfectly balanced. And then you get to the 8th stage, the final stage in the game, which consists of 3 mini stages, all of which are going to test your mastery of every aspect of the game, including most of the animal companion skill sets that you've used throughout your playthrough. Each mini stage in the final level ends with a boss that you have to fight as Nemo. But considering your candy doesn't damage enemies, you might wonder, well, how the heck do you fight these bosses? Well, it turns out that you'll receive a magical scepter that can both bop enemies to damage them, as well as be charged up to fire a magical projectile in an upward diagonal trajectory that also pushes you back a bit, which can be tricky if you fire it off while you're standing near, say, a pit, but is otherwise very useful, as you can fire off a mostly uncharged projectile if in danger, or charge it up longer for a more powerful attack. Using that scepter, which you can switch to by pressing the select button on your controller, is a literal game changer, and makes the final 3 mini stages in Nemo feel like a bit of a different experience than the rest of the game. Those stages, by the way, are much more challenging than the preceding 7 stages, and if you end up dying at any point in those 3 mini stages, you need to restart from the beginning of the first mini stage. Meaning, to beat the game, you have to beat those 3 mini stages and the related bosses without losing all of your lives, which is a bit of a difficulty spike in comparison to the rest of the game. That said, even this most challenging part of the game can be overcome with practice, and despite needing to restart from the beginning of the first mini stage if you lose all of your lives, the game never gets overly frustrating. Because at a minimum, you have unlimited tries to get better and eventually beat the game's challenges. And those 3 final mini-stages are not all that long, so it doesn't really add a ton of gameplay time to the overall experience. It does add a little bit more frustration than what you might feel playing the game up to that point, but otherwise, it's really not all that bad. I'm actually really excited to talk more about the specific aspects of Little Nemo, which we're going to do in a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos to look up. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Little Nemo, the Dream Master, the back of the box says, Capcom USA, premier worldwide arcade game designer. Little Nemo, Dream Master. Journey to a land of wonder. Little Nemo receives a royal invitation to visit the castle in Slumberland. Is he dreaming? It seems the princess is looking for a new playmate. When he arrives, he's told that King Morpheus has been kidnapped. Nemo sets off on a wild adventure to rescue the good king and restore peace to the land. Anything can happen in this realm of imagination. Little Nemo even learns how to get a ride from local creatures so he can pass through the roughest parts of Slumberland. And then a few bullets. Spectacular graphics bring a dream world to life. Launch a candy attack against the scarier creatures of Slumberland, and rescue the king of good dreams and thwart the master of nightmares. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, and I've got to say, yeah, mostly, this box sells me on the title. I mean, the screenshots make the game look really good, although I will say that the text on the back of the box, and I'm just thinking back to how I was when I was younger, the text on the back of the box makes it sound like a game designed for children, because it's like, hey, Nemo's going to go through Slumberland, he's going to be dreaming, you got to save the good king and thwart the nightmares. It sounds like a game designed for kids, and you are controlling a kid throughout the majority of the game. But knowing what I know now, this one might have been a little bit challenging for kids. So even though the overall structure of the game and the story is very young focused, or I'll say it seems to be targeted towards a younger demographic, the game itself is actually quite good for anybody of any age. But just looking at the box itself, I don't know. It feels like it's focused a little bit more on that younger demographic. And knowing me around the time when this came out, so I would have been around 11-ish when this came out in the United States, I think I might have looked at it and thought, this is a kid's game. I'm mature. I'm almost a teenager at that point. So no, I don't know that I would have picked it up when I was younger. Looking at it today, seems charming. So the box mostly sells me on the title. Anyway, we're going to move past the box and start talking about the more specific aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Little Nemo look really good. Capcom's artistry is on full display here. The colors are bright and vibrant. Each stage is unique and diverse. These graphics, just generally speaking, are very impressive for an 8-bit title. You would never mistake it for 16-bit graphics, but within the confines of the 8-bit NES limitations, this is one really good-looking game. Even beyond just the visual component, animations are all great, with various characters and enemies all moving exactly as you would expect, with some minor flavor animations even thrown in for good measure. Everything about Little Nemo looks outstanding, and I am not exaggerating when I say that this might be one of the best-looking Capcom platforming titles from the company's 8-bit era of gaming. It's truly impressive work. Moving on to the sound and music, not to be outdone, the music in the game is phenomenal. Like, legitimately phenomenal. There's not a single bad track in the game, and like many of Capcom's other 8-bit platforming titles, the music here is superb. In fact, I would argue that this might be one of the best 8-bit platformer soundtracks in video game history, and I've got to say, that was a major surprise for me. I never expected such auditory excellence from Little Nemo, but seriously, this game sounds great. Sound effects are similarly high quality, though the star of the show from an audio perspective is definitely the music. It's so good that I've been listening to it independently after beating the game. I can't remember the last 8-bit title that impressed me so much with its music. I mean it, I am shocked. But the fact is, Little Nemo's music is simply perfect. Moving on to the story, you play as a boy named Nemo, who every night when he falls asleep is whisked off to Slumberland, where he experiences various dreams filled with locations to explore, enemies to defeat, and animals to befriend. At first, you assume that you're simply dreaming like anyone when they might fall asleep, but in reality, you've been recruited to participate in a long-standing fight between the Master of Nightmares and Slumberland's otherwise peaceful inhabitants, a feud that resulted in the kidnapping of Slumberland's king. As you play the game, you'll eventually learn that you need to defeat the evil Master of Nightmares to both save the king and ensure Slumberland's continual survival, as the Master of Nightmares is determined to invade and take over Slumberland and make it his own evil hellscape. This can't be allowed to happen, and it turns out Slumberland's only hope is you. So I've got to say, I really enjoyed the story here. Don't get me wrong, it is very simplistic, but I loved the fact that it existed at all, and I appreciated the mini cutscenes that played out between each level, which even in the early 90s was a rarity in 8-bit titles. Will this narrative win any awards? No, probably not, but that's okay. The story that is here is just enough to give you a reason to play the game, and make the game feel a bit higher stakes than it otherwise would, and honestly, that's pretty much perfect for this kind of experience. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we already talked a fair amount about the general controls for the game and the structure of the game, so I'm not going to rehash all that stuff here. But what I do want to reiterate is that overall, the game is very well balanced. Other than the 8th and final stage, where you have a few mini stages where if you fail, you do have to restart those mini stages from the very beginning. Other than that difficulty spike, The game is pretty darn balanced throughout the entirety of your playthrough. There's a huge variety of levels and diversity of animals and their attacks and general mechanics that make the game feel fresh as you continue to play throughout each level. And those levels are designed really, really well. Even the train level, which I know, I don't know, if you've played the game, if you've played Nemo, the train level has gotten to a point where some people have a real issue with it. And just to give a little bit of a description of what it is, there is a level in the game where you will ride on top of a train. It's effectively an auto-scrolling level, and you have to avoid different enemies. You have to avoid different spikes and other traps within the environment. You've got to kind of move around this train as it's moving progressively more towards the other side of the screen. This is one of those levels where the comparison to the Battletoads Turbo Tunnel level is fair in that you really don't have much control other than moving out of the way to avoid obstacles. The level's going to play regardless of what you do. So from that perspective, I can see the comparison, but the train level itself, it's really not all that bad. I mean, once you play it a few times, you'll know where the special pitfalls are. You'll know where the traps are that you have to avoid certain things. You have to duck here or jump there or whatever the case might be. It really wasn't all that bad, but I see people constantly talk about the fact that the train level is this ultra difficult level in the game. Personally, I don't really see it. I mean, obviously, difficulty is a subjective thing for everyone. So if that personally for you is a really hard level, I completely respect that. But I think it was a fine level. It was actually kind of fun to go through and try to defeat. So even though most people say the train level kind of sucks, I actually really enjoyed that level. Even though it was a little bit more challenging than some of the others and you lose a little bit of your own personal control as you play the game, the train level is fine for what it is. It's a little bit of a difficulty spike, but honestly, not really. And the fact is, as I look across the entirety of the game, the overall design of the experience, and as I sit here reflecting upon my recent playthrough, I just come to the conclusion that every single level here is expertly designed to give a perfect challenge. It's not easy, but it's not brutal. This is perhaps one of the best 8-bit platforming titles that I have ever played. And this recommendation does not come lightly. I've played a ton of 8-bit platformers, and I have to say, Little Nemo surprised me. So, what is our verdict on Little Nemo the Dream Master? Well, it's probably not a surprise, but this is an amazing game, and one that surprised me from beginning to end. I never expected Little Nemo to be as good as it is, not because I had heard bad things about it, but simply because I thought I had played most of the major 8-bit platforming titles in the NES library. I was very obviously very wrong in my belief, because I clearly missed Little Nemo back when I was younger, and having played it for this episode of the podcast, I now realize just how bad of a miss this was. Given how much I've gushed about the game already, it's probably not a surprise, but Little Nemo the Dream Master is a surefire inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming, and honestly, might go even a little bit further to become one of my personal favorite 8-bit platformers of all time. This is one seriously good game, and I encourage everyone to give this one a shot. Trust me on this one. Little Nemo the Dream Master is an amazing experience, and is therefore undoubtedly deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. It is now time for our weekly challenges. These are, of course, associated with Little Nemo the Dream Master for the NES. Your first challenge is to fly through the air with the help of a friend. If you can do that, you will earn 1 coin. Your second challenge is to take a ride on a train. There is a level in the game you'll eventually get to that is on a train. If you can get to that level, you will earn 2 coins. And then finally, your final challenge is to discover a stage where things go all topsy-turvy. If you can discover that stage, you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments over on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on Little Nemo the Dream Master. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Zaxxon for the Atari 2600 system. So definitely write in if you have any comments or opinions on that one, and have your feedback featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Zaxxon. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.